Hi, everyone. Because there's so many questions about trustworthiness, I thought I'd make a quick video just summarizing some of the key points so you can kind of understand some of the differences. So as a reminder, trustworthiness, we have these four criteria: confirmability, credibility, dependability, and transferability. They have a lot in common. So you might find yourself saying this strengthened this, but it actually also strengthened that. And that's totally fine. So just as a quick and dirty, I wanted to walk you through when we have trustworthiness, we're looking at the methods of the study. So that means our recruitment and our sampling. It also means our data collection and our data analysis. And that's really kind of the focus of our methodology, right? And then we always have our results. So for confirmability, what I'd like to think of for confirmability is it's really, you're looking at the researcher bias. So did my biases, because I have many of them, right? Did my biases as the researcher get in the way or influence the findings and not let the findings just be the findings, right? So where would we see a researcher bias kind of getting checked, right? So if I'm the researcher and I want to minimize the influence of my biases on the findings, how do I do that and where do I do that? Well, it can happen in a lot of places, but predominantly you're going to be looking at data analysis. So if I have more than one researcher, right, working together, then that other person's going to check me and be like, hey, wait a minute, you did this. And that's because you're a mom. And I saw that you pulled out all the mom themes more than the other themes, for example. So when you talk about more than one person working together, more than one researcher, that can keep your biases in check. It can have a little bit of influence maybe in data collection, but not quite as much as data analysis, because when you're analyzing the data, it's how you make sense of the data. It's how you choose what to pull out and what not to pull out. And my biases are really going to impact that. So what do I need to do to keep that in check? And a lot of times what we see, a keyword here is reflexivity, which is all the things I do to really reflect on myself and say, maybe I'm going to journal, or maybe I'm going to write down my biases, or maybe I'm going to have a roundtable discussion with other researchers as we look through the data analysis, or maybe I'm going to have somebody else analyze it completely separately, and then we look at them together to see our biases and keep those in check. So think researcher bias, not just bias in general, researcher bias specifically. So that's your confirmability. Really focus on your data analysis section, but really anywhere where there's some collaboration or discussion where we can keep each other in check and look at our biases, that's where you're going to really see enhancing confirmability. Truth and the whole truth, right? And this a lot of times relates to trust and honesty. So credibility is, are the results credible? Did we get the actual truth from participants, or were they kind of holding back because they didn't really feel comfortable, or were the interviews really, really short? So I don't really think we got full data here, or the whole big picture of all the data. So for credibility, I really want to see, okay, where would I find that we got the truth from our participants and that we got the whole truth? This actually can relate to recruitment and sampling, because if I only recruited a very, very small or a very specific demographic of my target population, I'm not getting the whole truth because I'm not getting all the perspectives. So I want to make sure I have a nice broad sample or representative sample, not necessarily big, but representative of the target population. Data collection is huge here for credibility, because if you interview me in front of all my classmates, which nobody would really do this, but if you interviewed me in front of all my classmates, I'm going to be a little self-conscious and maybe I'm not going to be as truthful, versus if you interview me in a private room and make sure I know that this is confidential and my name's not going to show up here, and these are the things that we're going to do to make sure you're comfortable. Now I'm going to tell you maybe a little bit more. It also has to do with the interview guide that you use. If your authors share the interview guide, which is awesome, they don't all do that, but if they share the interview guide, and again, we don't always see interviews, right? We might see focus groups, or we might see looking at documents, right? But very commonly interviews. And I look at the questions you ask. If the questions aren't leading questions, then that's a really good sign that you let me just talk. Versus if you tell me, how much did you love your research course? That's a question, but that's a leading question because you're planting ideas in my head, and I might not have loved my research course, but now I'm like, well, I guess it was nice to have some weeks off. I don't know, that part was nice. So now I'm not getting the whole truth by asking leading questions. I'm directing my participants instead of just letting them talk. So things that let your participants talk honestly and openly are very, very helpful for getting the truth. And then even data analysis can show up here a little bit as well. with your credibility, because not only do I want to make sure I see or I get the full truth from my participants, but I also want to know that when we analyze the data that we're showing the truth and the whole truth from my participants. So if my data analysis is very, I have a lot of bias in there, it's kind of glossed over, there's not a lot of detail in there, then how do I really know that we got the truth from our participants? Sometimes even the researcher bias can show up here, right? So this is where we see things that if I did things in here to enhance reflexivity to make sure that we got the results that the participants shared and not my biases, that's actually the exact same thing that can enhance credibility too. So this is where you might see some repetition, okay? For dependability, now I'm asking, can I reproduce this study or duplicate? And if I were to reproduce it or duplicate it, would I get the same results? So were they consistent? So things like if I had protocols, if I did things to make sure everybody was doing things similarly, so we don't have one researcher that does a 5-minute interview and another one that does a 3-hour interview, right? We want to be consistent, and I want instructions for how to be consistent. So when I think of dependability, I think of give me lots and lots of detailed instructions for how to do your study. So things like how did you sample? So that's going to show up here as well. So details about the sample and the recruiting, because those are those instructions to reproduce the study. Details about data collection, absolutely. That's, again, another detail I need to be able to reproduce the study. And details about data analysis, absolutely, to reproduce your study, to do your study again. And then as I look at all of those things, what things did they do? What details did they share about how they made sure they were consistent across the board throughout the whole study? So things like we made sure we only did 1 interview a day because people get tired at the end of 3 hours of interviews. So maybe that's something we did to make sure we were consistent, or we had an interview guide, or we did monitoring or audits or things like that to make sure that everybody was following the rules per se. So dependability, you're really looking at the entire methodology section and saying, did you give me lots of detail? That's one good thing. And then were those details helpful in understanding that everybody was consistent throughout the study? And then last is transferability. And another way to think of this is applicability. Or who does it, the who and the where, and even the when. So who and where and when was your study? And if I look at your results and I see, oh, you had 13 college students in 2022 in Northern Alabama. And they were of this ethnicity, this percentage, this ethnicity, this other percentage. They had this level of income. They had this major. I gave you all these details. This is all about detail in the sample and the setting. So in transferability, I really want to know, where did you do your study and who was in your study? And then if you tell me that really, really well, I can now look at your findings and say, I take care of college students, and my college students that I want to know if your study relates to them look a lot like the college students that you described really well. So now I know I can transfer those findings onto my participants. So, or onto my people, right? The people I take care of. So transferability isn't about this broad generalizability that we use for quantitative research, right? Where I want to be able to apply it to every possible college student in the entire country. Not the idea. Transferability is enhanced when you have lots and lots of detail. So maybe you only had 15 or 20 college students, but you told me as much as you possibly could about those college students. Were they first generation? Were they English as a second language? What were their ethnicities? What was their income level? What was their major? Did they double major? Were they athletes? All of those details that are relevant to my study would help me. Sorry, this is telling me to, sorry about that. All these details are telling me about the sample and giving me details about the sample so that I know who these results apply to. A criticism of transferability is not, well, they didn't include, biomechanical majors, or they didn't include enough graduate students or something like that. That's not the idea here. The idea for this is really, did they describe who they had in enough detail so that I can determine who this transfers to? Not did they describe everybody they possibly could have? So that's the discrepancy between quantitative and qualitative, okay? So the way I see these two, because they have a lot in common, it's all about detail. This is detail in the sample and setting. This is also detail in the sample and setting, but detail everywhere else, so I can duplicate the study. So that's how you can kind of see the similarities. So for credibility and confirmability, you're going to see some repetition, maybe with data analysis, things the way I got the whole truth and nothing but the truth, with eliminating or not eliminating, but reducing researcher bias. And then with dependability and transferability, it's a lot about detail. And I'm going to see some repetition with sampling and setting, because I need detail to be able to replicate, and I need detail to be able to determine who this applies to. So I hope that helps clear up some questions. Those are the most common questions I get. And yeah, hope this helps you with your paper and your tables.